Welcome, 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 y bienvenidos to our conversation on democratic values. We're excited to have you all join us today for an expert panel and conversation on the topic of reclaiming democracy, narratives, civic space, and action. My name is Chantel Stewart. My pronouns are she and they, and I'm a member of Metropolitan Group. I'll be your MC for today's conversation, as well as your in-house tech support. So if during this webinar you have any technical difficulties, please chat me directly so that I'm able to assist you. We'd like for this to be more of a discussion. So as you have questions or comments, please type them into the chat box and we'll get to as many of them as we can throughout the course of the conversation. If you have questions for a specific panelist, please be sure to include their name in the chat. Also, Zoom has an accessibility feature that we use for our webinars. You should see an icon that says either live transcript or show captions at the bottom of your Zoom window. If you click into that and choose live transcript, you should begin to see that Zoom will transcribe audio from this session with moderate success in real time. We'd also like you to know that this webinar is being simultaneously interpreted into Spanish by our interpreter, Agnes Herrera. Hola, Agnes. If you go to the bottom of your Zoom window, you'll see a globe icon. Simply click on that icon and click the language that you'd like to hear spoken. So for example, if you'd like to listen to this conversation in Spanish, please click the globe and select Spanish. If Alejandro, our panelist from ISMG, switches to Spanish, please select English and Agnes will simultaneously interpret into English. You can also select off to hear the conversation as is with no interpretation. Just as a reminder to our panelists, as this conversation is being simultaneously interpreted, please be sure to speak at a pace and volume that is mindful to our interpreter. We encourage you to live tweet if you'd like, using the hashtags Power of Voice and Democracy in Action. And please be sure to tag and follow us on Twitter and Instagram at MetGroup. Thank you all so much for joining us. We're so excited to get this conversation started. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to our moderator for today's event, Eric Friedenwald-Fishman, CEO, founder, and creative director at Metropolitan Group.
Great. Thank you, Chantel, and welcome to everybody who's joined us today. We are joined today by incredible change agents from around the US and Mexico and from around the world. We are thrilled that colleagues from foundations, from civil society organizations, from activist coalitions, from federal and state agencies, from the media and from academia are joining us today. It's the work of all of these groups that makes the difference in terms of advancing democratic values, which is the core of our conversation today. So really appreciate all of you being here. Again, my name is Eric Friedenwald-Fishman, he, him. I'm looking forward to engaging with you and our incredible panel today. In a moment, I'm going to introduce our panelists and get our conversation going. But first, I'd like to recognize the indigenous lands that I'm zooming in from today. And certainly, if you want to share where you're zooming in from, and you can do so in the chat. But we want to recognize that there's been harm from colonialism and white supremacy with the removal of people from these lands who have not only inhabited them for centuries, but still are sovereign nations that are critical partners in the lands today. And we also want to acknowledge the legacy of slavery of African peoples who built much of the infrastructure that our nation relies upon. I'm zooming to you from Portland, Oregon, in the traditional homelands of the Chinook, Willamette, Multnomah, Wasco, Worsham, and other Chinookan peoples, as well as the Tualatin, Kalapuya, Malala, Cayuse, Warm Springs, and Yakima nations. Their relationships with this land goes back millennia, and they are the peoples of the Willamette and Columbia River from which we get sustenance. So I invite you, if you would like to do an acknowledgement of where you're zooming in from, to do so in the chat. The format that we're going to use today is I'm going to set a little bit of context for the conversation. We are going to hear from each of our panelists some reflections that they have about the topic. We'll then have a conversation among the panel and then open it up for a broader conversation with all of you who are here. So please feel free as we go to put questions, thoughts, comments in the chat. I think Chantel talked about this being an expert convening. It's a change agents convening, and everybody who's joining has experiences, perspective, knowledge, and work that's valuable to this conversation and discourse. So I'm sure everyone who has chosen to join this discussion reads, sees, hears virtually every day that democracy is at a crossroads. We hear that democracy is being challenged. We hear that the democracy is in decline. We hear and see, and many of the folks who are joining us today constantly talk about how democracy cannot be taken for granted. And by democracy, I want to be really clear, we do not just mean holding elections. There are many places where elections are held and people, even in places where they are observed to be free and fair, where core democratic values are being dismantled by folks who are winning elections. So elections are an important part of democracy, but by democracy, we're not just talking about elections, and we're also not just talking about the form of democracy that is embedded in the US, but rather we're talking about a set of principles, a set of systems of governance that are really based on seeing universal human rights as fundamental, and that really value and strive to create systems that support fundamental principles of freedoms like expression and media and press, a rule of law that's centered on equity before the law, a sense of inclusion and pluralism in terms of who society serves and who has a voice in society. Real work to have checks and balances on power so that you have deliberative decision making, a commitment to transparency and inclusion, and the many other practices and institutions that come together to form what we are referring to as democracy, really a set of principles around having a pluralistic, multicultural society with checks and balances that strives to create a more just and equitable society for all of us. And we have all seen that we're in a period where authoritarianism and nationalism combined are on the rise on every continent, save perhaps for Antarctica. Just in September of this year, just last month, we saw Sweden, which is often self-branded as the humanitarian superpower, have a real dramatic win for the party of the Swedish Democrats, which just a few years ago was a fringe party with almost no electoral wins, and is now the fastest rising party in the parliament. A new conservative government is being formed, and the prime minister has resigned, all based upon a really weaponized anti-migrant narrative. We saw at the same time, in the same month, Italy moved to having the Brothers of Italy party, truly a neo-fascist party that has its roots out of fascism in post-World War II, moved to have the most right-wing prime minister that Italy has had since World War II. Just an important note, in 4 years, Brothers of Italy went from 4% of the vote to 26% of the vote. We are seeing Fernando Marcos Jr. winning the presidency in the Philippines with a narrative that is pointing to nostalgia for the era of the Marcos regime and is otherizing and creating a sense of enemies. Bukele in El Salvador, not only adopting the handle world's coolest dictator, but arresting over 40,000 people in a matter of weeks with the state of exception, and now announcing an unconstitutional run for the presidency for another term, with the narrative that the Constitution should serve the people don't serve the Constitution. Everyone on this call, I'm sure, has followed the narratives and the policies in Hungary, where Orban is really creating a concept and trying to build legitimacy internationally for a structure of illiberal democracy. We see President Said in Tunisia, a former constitutional law scholar and professor, working to dismantle this democratic institutions with a recent change of the constitution after a state of emergency, disbanding the parliament. And of course, in all of these, we see use of fear-based narratives that not only are bolstering autocratic rule, but are doing so through a really conscious focus on otherizing those in opposition as enemies. And of course, we see this all happening in the US and Mexico as well. In the US, we all on this call witnessed our armed insurrection of the US Capitol just over a year and a half ago. We currently have an election coming up where a significant number of elected officials who are running for re-election and of candidates of major parties are spreading disinformation and seeking to discredit the legitimacy of a free and fair presidential election. We see literally dozens of places where laws are being changed to restrict voting access and to move electoral decision-making from voters to legislators. And we are seeing, in the same vein that I described internationally, a significant increase in the use of not only weaponized narratives, but narratives that demonize the opposition, literally using words like satanic and that justify a politics of violence with old narratives that are having a resurgence among senior leaders of replacement theory. But at the same time, we're also seeing critical places where people are standing up for democratic values and institutions. We're seeing the resilience of people, of social movements, and of democracies, and signs of places that can inspire us to take action. And we'll be talking about those today. And so I just want to point out that we are all seeing civil society groups and activists really defending and using civic space, making sure that the public square is a place that bolsters equitable rule of law and reform to justice systems, and standing up for the most vulnerable populations in their communities. We're seeing this from San Salvador to Tehran, from Mexico City to Washington, D.C., the important power that civic space has in advancing more democratic structures and pushing back against authoritarian moves. We're seeing organizers and community leaders and committees and coalitions investing in really authentic and democratic engagement and power building to shift the dynamics within democracies about who's being centered, whose voices are being amplified, what is being prioritized. And this is having impact. In the US, we see the work of analysts like Steve Phillips and political leaders and organizers like Stacey Abrams driving wins. We see coalitions and organizers and activists creating significant increases in political participation, ranging from Harris County, Texas to Georgia. We see civil society groups like Equities in Mexico galvanizing huge coalitions to increase gender equity as a part of how justice is delivered. And we see people like President Sandu in Moldova centering accountability and real anti-corruption reforms as the core for not only for the election campaign, but for how governing is happening. And finally, we're seeing advocates for democratic values really recognizing the power of narrative and increasingly realizing the need to move to narratives that are based on values and that connect with people's emotions, rather than narratives that are really focused on policies and technical constructs. And finally, we are seeing lots of action of the need to meet people where they are and to create real change and real action where democracy, when people participate, can best impact people's lives and can create systems of justice and systems of governance where people authentically feel like their voices are heard and that deliberative decision-making takes place. So we're really excited today to have a conversation with a group of colleagues who have fantastic and diverse experience working on issues of democracy, governance, and human rights in the US, in Mexico, and around the world. This team represents storytellers, legal scholars, folks who have worked in media, folks who've worked in civil society, folks who've worked as human rights defenders, all of whom do work connected to storytelling and its impact on policy practice and social norms. Each of our panelists are going to take a couple of minutes to introduce themselves and then to share perspectives on the topic of democracy at a crossroads. Both what are some of the challenges we are seeing and facing, what are we learning, and where might there be some opportunities to advance forward. After we hear from each of the panelists, we'll have a discussion among the panel and then open it up for a discussion from the group. So with that, I'd like to hand it off to the first of our panelists, Erin Bloom. Erin, please introduce yourself and share some of your thoughts.
Thanks, Eric. Hi, everybody. My name is Erin Bloom. I'm a senior director with Metropolitan Group. My background is in conflict negotiation and violence reduction work. I have worked on the Syrian peace process, on work with developing and bolstering civil society in Burma. And I've also worked domestically on crime and violence reduction initiatives in a number of cities in the United States. My background is largely in kind of the practitioner side of, violence reduction, coalition building, but also I have, a great interest in democratic theory and principles generally. And so this conversation today is of great interest to me. I want to kind of get back to something that Eric said a minute ago, which is that democracy cannot and should not be conflated with the idea with simply elections, and even free and fair elections. We are seeing right now worldwide this rise of authoritarianism and authoritarian leaders, and it's happening at ballot boxes. It's happening in elections that are being, that are legitimate, and that international observers are saying are being conducted correctly. And we are still seeing authoritarian leaders riding into power and also using democratic institutions to further their own autocratic or authoritarian policies. I was living in Turkey in 2016 when there was a coup, an attempted coup that ushered in a state of emergency. And then that was in June 2016. And in the spring of 2017, a constitutional referendum vote was held that significantly constricted civil society space and gave a lot more power to President Erdogan and his government. And it passed because, by all accounts, that election was legitimate, and there was there was not significant, ballot box stuffing or foul play. It was simply the will of the people. And so I think that as we are deciding and discussing what democracy needs to mean and what it needs to incorporate, we need to move beyond the idea that elections are the end goal of a democratic state, and when in fact it's just one tool. A democracy is intended to be a government that operates by the will of the people, and if the ballot box is the only way that people are able to make their leaders hear them and listen to them and follow their influence, that is not a true democratic state. And so we need to talk about how people can influence their governments beyond elections. And this includes robust civil society, the freedoms of expression and demonstration and protest, and the need to, and the ability to advance policies and positions from the street as well as from the ballot box. This is also important even in established democracies like the United States, where our democratically elected leaders are increasingly cloistered and removed from the normal lived experiences of most people. And so if we are not able to influence them and lead them in the right direction through a whole host of tools, then the true democratic nature of our country will continue to erode. There's also a second facet to democracy that needs to be amplified to, I think, to an equal level, which is that a democratic country needs to protect the minority populations and the oppressed populations from the tyranny of the majority. And we see this where elections on issues such as anti-gay legislation or anti-immigrant referendums are able to pass fairly easily because of widespread racism or widespread homophobia, and the idea that civil liberties can be left to a vote when is one that leaves a lot of people kind of at the whim of shifting and changing public opinion, and can lead to a lot of harm. And so a democratic country needs strong democratic institutions that can withstand wavering and shifting public opinion. And we see that in courts. Some of the most significant American advancements in civil liberties have happened in the courts. Roe v. Wade and Brown versus Board of Education and Lawrence versus Texas. These are examples of times when the courts have pushed forward liberal public policy often faster than public opinion was getting there. And so these are, I think, the kind of tenets of a true democratic state that need to be discussed at an equal volume and level as when we are talking about free and fair elections. So I will pause there, and I think, Delma, you are up next.
Thank you, Erin. Thank you, Eric. Thank you to panelists and our guests as well. I appreciate the opportunity to be a part of this conversation. My name is Delma Jackson. I am a senior director here at Metropolitan Group. And I am based in what is now known as Flint, Michigan, formerly unceded, known to this day as unceded Potawatomi territory. And I just want to recognize that. And my pronouns are he, him. That said, yeah, I come from largely an academic background, rooted in the intersection of both history and pop culture. So how narratives are made, distributed, understood, absorbed, et cetera, and largely through the lens of the African-American experience and the African diaspora beyond that. I am also an Americanist in the sense that I'm always fascinated with the way in which America understands itself, presents itself to the rest of the world, et cetera. And so I think I will kind of hone some of my comments on a kind of American specific lens, although I understand so much of what we see here is obviously being, if not replicated, mirrored, right, on a global scale. I am, first of all, coming from a place where I am moving away from a type of cynicism that I initially felt for the last few weeks, I think, just following the news cycle, right? It's very easy for me to listen to NPR a little too much to the point where I'm just like, man, why am I even bothering? But I have had a more recent opportunity to engage with my main man, Frederick Douglass, recently, right? Just going back, doing some reading, listening to some of to other people read from some of his lectures. And I'm reminded of a couple things from Douglass, right? To the point that both Eric and Aaron have made so eloquently, right? Around the idea of how we engage beyond the ballot box. I am reminded of something that Frederick Douglass said, and I'm just paraphrasing here, but he notes that in the whole of history of progress around human liberty, we've seen time and time again that concessions are born of earnest struggle, right? And if there is no struggle, there is no progress. And those of us who would profess to favor freedom and yet deprecate agitation are those who want crops without plowing the ground. Power concedes nothing without a demand. It never has and it never will. For the limits of tyranny are prescribed by the endurance of those whom they oppress, right? And so the ballot box cannot ever be the sum total, the end all be all of the way in which we engage in a democratic society. I could not agree with that sentiment more. And to understand what, for me to incorporate what Douglass is offering here is to understand that I need to move out of the mistake I think I used to make, particularly in undergrad when I'm becoming kind of newly politicized and thinking of what democracy looks like in a very narrow way. And as I've aged and grown and encountered different people, different ideas, different cultures, coming to fully appreciate the fact that I cannot afford to be limited by the confines of the world I know, right? And I should always feel free to question and to look to other examples Within the United States alone, we have over 500 sovereign indigenous nations with very different ways of approaching governance. And I am looking everywhere I can to look for ways in which to not just engage with the tools that I already have at hand, but to lean in fully to the tools that others globally have to offer to begin to address some of the issues that we have. The other piece I will say to that end is that my ancestor, Audre Lorde, said it best, I think, when she knows that there is no such thing as a single issue struggle because we do not live single issue lives. And so often when I think back to when I initially became politicized in the way in which my lens was solely focused in a somewhat patriarchal lens, right, in African-American studies, coming to understand and to broaden my understanding of the way in which power and oppression often coexist and looks similar across various social identities. And so at this stage of my life, I'm not only looking to different examples of how they engage with one another within democratic pluralistic values, but I'm also broadening that tent, right? Because at the end of the day, if we really want to see progress, I think we are going to have to do so with one another and not doing so in a way that solely focuses on the issues that I simply think are important, but getting much better at understanding that my freedom is inextricably bound up in the freedom of everyone else around me, whether I share their worldview or not, whether I share their gender identity or not, whether I share their faith systems or not, none of that matters, right? And I'll end with this quote from Malcolm, who said, "It's freedom for everybody, or it's freedom for nobody." And with that, I will pass it on to Alejandro. Thank you.
Gracias, Delma. Un momento para que pasen a la interpretación en español. Bueno, realmente nunca me ha gustado la lectura de currículums, así que solamente les comento que pues no soy académico, aunque tenga el título, aunque haya dado clases. Tampoco me considero periodista, aunque por un rato haya sido editor de un sitio web sobre la violencia en México y he escrito un par de libros sobre periodismo. Tampoco me considero defensor de derechos humanos, aunque he acompañado algunas causas. Y me gusta estar en medio de las categorías. Me gusta estar ahí, huyendo de los títulos y de las categorías. Y creo que desde la comunicación estratégica, aquí con Impacto Social Metropolitan Group, sigo ahí. Si tuviéramos la oportunidad de estar en un auditorio en donde pudiera ver todas sus caras, pudiera ver sus expresiones, seguramente les preguntaría cuántas personas han visitado México. Algunas levantarían la mano con emoción, porque México es un país muy bello, aunque seguramente algunos solamente conocerían Cabo o Cancún, que no es exactamente México, pero bueno, seguramente algunos otros habrían estado en la Ciudad de México y con suerte habrían caminado por el Paseo de la Reforma. El Paseo de la Reforma es una de las avenidas más emblemáticas de la ciudad. Los mexicanos solemos decir que nuestro himno es el segundo más bonito después de la Marsellesa y que Reforma es la segunda avenida más bonita después de Champs-Élysées. Realmente, si han tenido la oportunidad de caminar por el Paseo de la Reforma, se dan cuenta que es una calle espectacular, ¿no? Las personas más observadoras, y no crean que estoy hablando de turismo, entraremos en tema brevemente, se habrán dado cuenta que esa avenida, el espacio público en el cual está instalada, ha cambiado en los últimos 10 años. Frente a la Bolsa Mexicana de Valores, edificio hermoso de cristal con una cúpula preciosa. Ahora hay una estructura con un más 65 y una jaula con cascos de mineros, que hace referencia a los 65 mineros que no fueron rescatados en Pasta de Conchos hace ya casi 2 décadas. En la esquina de la información, donde todavía hay una escultura del artista Sebastián, que a mí en lo personal no me gusta, pero es una escultura monumental, y donde están las principales oficinas de los periódicos en México, se puede ver un más 43 en rojo, que recuerda a los estudiantes de Ayotzinapa que fueron desaparecidos, y también recuerda a los más de 100,000 desaparecidos que ha habido en México en los últimos años. E incluso casi enfrente de la Embajada de los Estados Unidos hay un más 72 que hace referencia a los migrantes asesinados en San Fernando, Tamaulipas, y que tiene una leyenda que dice: migrar es un derecho. Si se van al centro, enfrente del afrancesado Palacio de Bellas Artes, ahora se tendrán que mover un poco hacia la avenida para tomar la foto, porque hay una estructura con un puño y el símbolo de lo femenino, que es conocida como la antimonumenta, que hace referencia a todos los crímenes de violencia de género que han sucedido en el país. Y bueno, podría seguir mencionando todo lo que ha cambiado esa avenida y el primer cuadro de la Ciudad de México. Seguramente, después de todas estas menciones, se podrán dar cuenta que mi intervención va sobre el espacio público, que es una parte fundamental de la democracia y de los valores democráticos, y por tanto de esta charla. Si además de haber visitado la Ciudad de México, les interesa la filosofía política, y después de todo lo que les he contado, seguramente podrán estar emocionados de que en esta avenida en la Ciudad de México, pues está gestando una lucha fundamental por el espacio público, por la memoria oficial contra una memoria no oficial, o para ponerlo en las palabras de la filósofa política Chantal Mouffe, hay una lucha en el espacio agonista. Y bueno, el qué mejor escenario de esta lucha por el espacio público, por el espacio cívico, por el espacio agonista, que la glorieta de las mujeres que luchan. En la glorieta de las mujeres que luchan, antes solía haber una estatua de Cristóbal Colón, que en muchos otros lugares del mundo han sido tiradas, arrancadas de su base por personas que no lo consideran pues como una alusión a la libertad. Al contrario, hace rato se mencionó el colonialismo, y pues muchas de estas estatuas pues representan eso, ¿no? El colonialismo. Y pues fue rebautizada como la glorieta de las mujeres que luchan. Fue instalado un antimonumento con una mujer, una niña con el puño en alto, y curiosamente pretende ser sustituida por la figura de una mujer indígena recientemente encontrada en Veracruz, y las personas que la quieren cambiar, curiosamente, es la regenta del Distrito Federal, la gobernadora del Distrito Federal, que posiblemente sea la candidata presidencial. Entonces tenemos la lucha en un lugar en medio del Paseo de la Reforma, en donde un grupo de colectivas de mujeres indígenas, de familiares de personas desaparecidas, de familiares de mujeres asesinadas, han instituido un lugar de memoria, un lugar de reflexión, de conciencia, y que está en pugna contra la narrativa de que, bueno, en México no pasa nada, mejor ponemos una estatua prehispánica. Pareciera que es solamente una glorieta, ¿no? Pero este tipo de iniciativas de intervención del espacio público parecieran como pequeños piquetes, pequeños ganchos al hígado a los poderes fácticos, ¿no? A los poderes locales, federales. Como les mencionaba al principio, podía hablar de varias iniciativas en diferentes estados, en diferentes ciudades, y que han sido quitadas, derruidas por la policía, por personas no identificadas, encapuchados, árboles con listones en donde están escritos los nombres de los desaparecidos, grafitis frente de lugares en donde sucedió alguna masacre, en cruces rosas, las cruces rosas que en memoria de los niños que murieron quemados en la guardería ABC por un caso de corrupción, y han sido tapados por los poderes fácticos, no solamente por el gobierno, a veces incluso por organizaciones criminales. Y a nivel federal pareciera que sucede lo mismo, ¿no? Que el espacio público solo se puede usar para eventos multitudinarios, eventos electorales, mítines del presidente de la República, conciertos, espectáculos, y cualquier acto que no cuadre con ese uso del espacio público es ridiculizado, es reprimido. Y el ejemplo más específico son las marchas feministas, que siempre, a partir de que se empezaron a realizar de manera multitudinaria, han sido reprimidas, curiosamente, para cuidar los monumentos y edificios públicos. Y entonces muchas de las participantes dicen, ojalá a nosotros nos cuidaran igual que cuidan un edificio. Si esto sucediera, México sería un país diferente. Entonces, yo voy a dejar mi reflexión ahí. Este es el escenario que se está viviendo en México y pues esperando pues sus preguntas y comentarios. Y pues le paso la palabra a mi buen amigo Jaime.
Thank you, Alex. Thank you for those powerful images and the other powerful words that we heard from the other panelists. My name is Chaim Malka. I'm a vice president with Metropolitan Group in our Washington, D.C. office. I like to consider myself a student of international affairs and have studied international affairs for most of my adult life, with a particular emphasis in trying to understand social and political dynamics in the North African Maghreb and the Middle East, a region that has seen a lot of intense debate about democracy and authoritarianism over the last decade or so. So I want to share a perspective on how perceptions and expectations of democracy have changed and are changing worldwide over the last several decades, and the impact of those changes, because I think it's helpful to get that historical perspective to help us put the current struggle into some context. And if we look back at the post-World War II era, democracy was about rebuilding Europe after the devastation of World War II, about establishing democratic institutions and building newly independent states that were emerging from repression and colonization. And democracy and its close counterpart, free market capitalism, was intended to bring order and stability to large parts of the world that had seen unimaginable mass killing and suffering and economic collapse, and had witnessed the slavery and oppression of colonial regimes. And so democracy was really framed and seen as a force for stability, order, prosperity, security, all values that are really important to most people around the world, regardless of where they live. And there was a very clear contrast between democratic societies and democratic states and autocratic societies or dictatorships. Now, with that said, we can all come up with a very long list of exceptions to that picture of democracy bringing order and stability and prosperity that I've just framed. There are countless examples of the United States supporting repressive regimes, dictators, and many other exceptions to democracy promoting stability and equality, stability and prosperity. But I think at a broad level, it is true to say that large majorities of people in many countries around the world aspired to democracy and to live in democratic countries because they believed that democracy would improve their lives, bring prosperity, security, and dignity. And by the 1990s, the early 90s, we saw the collapse of the Soviet Union, the transition from military regimes and dictatorships in South America, in Africa. We saw the opening of the People's Republic of China, and more people around the world gained access to three core things: information that was not controlled by the state, elections or competitive or semi-competitive political processes, and access to consumer goods. But in many parts of the world, democracy didn't deliver that prosperity, stability, and security that many people expected and were promised, or it only delivered those benefits to a very small minority of people. And so in countries that made those transition from military regimes or dictatorships, people were promised and believed and expected that democracy was the best path to improving their lives. And people's expectations were extremely high about what democracy could do for them. It would end poverty, it would create more equal societies, it would resolve conflicts, end repression, eradicate corruption and exploitation. But instead, what many people experienced is economic decline, deeper political polarization, corruption, political paralysis, and a fundamental inability of governments to solve fundamental socioeconomic challenges like access to healthcare, education, jobs, safety. Now, people by and large acknowledge that democracy is good, can be good, they should aspire to democracy, but it raises the question for many people, what has democracy done for me lately? And we see that narrative about what has democracy done for me lately coming up in a lot of research that we're conducting at Metropolitan Group. Many of the people on this panel are working on. That narrative, that disappointment, that disillusionment creates a nostalgia, and Eric mentioned the word nostalgia in his opening. It creates a nostalgia for the stability, the order that some dictatorships had established. And it creates an opening for demagogues, populists, hucksters to weaponize and orchestrate narratives that undermine democracy and democratic values, and that promote narratives that legitimize authoritarian tendencies. And we can see this arc playing out in so many countries around the world. Eric named a bunch of them at the beginning. I think one important example is Tunisia. And I remember that I was a election monitor in December 2014 for the first presidential election in Tunisia after the fall of more than 4 decades of dictatorship. And the excitement and the enthusiasm and the debate around democracy and what it was going to do for the country was so intense. And there was a process of democratization that Tunisia started to undergo. And that process inspired many other countries in the region that had also been deeply embedded in dictatorships and authoritarianism. And there were really high hopes. And you saw that the hopes were extremely broad, and they not only included things like elections and freedom of the press and freedom of assembly and expression, but the main slogans of the revolution were bread, freedom, and dignity. People wanted dignity, they wanted jobs, and they wanted dignity. And so people's idea, people's perceptions, people's expectations of what democracy was and what it could do for them really collided with a deteriorating security environment, increasing violence, deep political polarization, economic decline, and ultimately a political paralysis and inability of the government to address any of the core issues. And so people started to say already by 2014, 2015, 2016, when I was traveling there often, if this is democracy, I'll take the old system. At least under the dictator, we had jobs and we could walk at the streets at night in our neighborhood. And so this political paralysis and this disillusionment led last year to a complete political outsider, Kais Saied, who was a law professor, ran for president, won the election as an outsider, very quickly suspended the parliament, and pushed through a constitutional rewrite and referendum that not only expanded executive powers, but also eroded basic freedoms and rights, as well as checks and balances on presidential power. So this arc, this story, this is we see this going on and on in countries around the world, where there's this disillusionment with democracy. And while people still see democracy as important, that it can help them, they're just not seeing how it delivers and improves their daily lives. We see this in an interesting New York Times poll that was published this month and sparked a lot of articles about it. New York Times poll that showed that 71% of US voters polled believe that democracy is at risk, even if they don't agree on the topic. The problem is that only 7% identified it as the most pressing problem facing the country when you compare it to inflation, economy, crime, the right to abortion. So again, we see people around the world, including in this United States, recognizing that democracy is important, aspiring to democracy, but not really seeing how it affects their daily life or improves their daily lives, and therefore is not a priority. There's a glimmer of hope in that 71%, and I will wrap with this glimmer of hope. I wish the 71% who saw democracy at risk was higher, but it still suggests that people believe in the importance of democracy, of freedom of speech, of representation, and all the other basic rights that make up democracy that Eric and Aaron talked about in the middle. And that should give us some spark of hope and for the work that many of us on this call are doing. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Chaim, Delma, Aaron, and Alejandro, for sparking such great ideas and discourse. And there's a lot there to unpack. I'm going to throw out we'll probably just take a couple of questions and then open up for the broader community. Two that really sparked for me as I was listening to all that you were saying, because you each hit on this, and Chaim, you were just talking about how each of you, as a part of your work, a part of your study, really looks at the impact of narratives and what are the narratives. And I'm really curious, Chaim, you just were talking about some of the narratives that democracy had post World War II and into the 90s, et cetera. I'm just curious if other panelists have places that they've got observations in terms of the story, the meta story or narrative that is being said about the value of democracy, and what are we seeing that's working and what are we seeing that's not working, or there's places where that story has opportunity for improvement. And I don't know, maybe I could hand that off. Maybe Delma, you could get us started, and others, please jump in.
I was afraid you might start with me. Do me a favor, re-ask your question for me.
I'm curious what each of us in our work and studies are seeing in terms of the narratives or the meta stories about democracy, and are there places that we're seeing opportunity of things that are working, and there are places that are seeing challenges. So for example, this Sunday, there was a editorial in the New York Times talking about by Anand Harris, talking about how many of the pro-democracy narratives and stories are really wonkish and are also really focused on the sense of fatalism and talking about how the places that we're seeing democracy in terms of people's participation increasing and equity increasing are where there's stories and narratives that not only give hope, but are really connecting to people's values and emotions. So that was an observation that he made in his editorial. So I'm just curious what people are seeing in their studies in Mexico and the US and around the world in terms of what's working, what's not working, in terms of things we could be looking to.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I think so much of what has allowed democracy to flourish, and I use the term flourish loosely, has largely been based on which aspects of any given society are included in its initial launching, right? To go back to something Chaim was pointing to, particularly around economics, right? It sparked something in me, and I had to do a quick Google search, and I remembered I was able to locate where, Ta-Nehisi Coates talks about this notion that by erecting a slave society, America created the economic foundation for its great experiment in democracy, right?
Mhm.
So often I think about the ways in which an economic foundation built off the bodies, the labor of others, supplies the necessary resources to then launch into an experiment in democracy. And often those same folks whose bodies, resources, lands, and other resources stripped away are then in an uphill battle to be included into that system of democracy. And so one of the first thoughts I had when you were asking this question, the last time I had the opportunity to be in the Netherlands, it's been a while now. It's almost 10 years ago. I can't believe how long it's been. But in 2014, I was studying there and specifically looking at the rise of the Afro-Dutch voice within the Dutch culture. And one of the pieces that we are seeing in a lot of places around the world, not just in the Netherlands, has to do with the idea that demographic change can often lead to that otherizing that we've all been naming and talking about here, right? Whose voice gets to be included, whose voice gets to be heard, and what are the traditional values of a given society, and how does that demographic shift and those new voices in that public square, how does that challenge those ideas of what a society thinks of itself, right? And so to be able to see and interview a few different folks while I was there who identify as Afro-Dutch and are actively engaged in moving the national conversation there forward, finding allies, locating ways to tell story, to lean into narrative, and to make clear where those intersectional desires, concerns, what we have in common, right? As a methodology for de-otherizing. I don't even know if that's a thing, but I'm gonna just go with that.
Mhm.
A method of using story to center values, and
Mhm.
values being more often universal than not. And using that as a means to grow the size of the people, the tent you're under, so that as you're pushing for a new set of values, a new vision of yourself, you have more and more voices joining together to move that. And I think that is crucial no matter where we're talking about.
Mm.
Yeah, absolutely. I just in terms of kind of what is like a promising sign, I think of democratic institutions, I think is the labor movements that we've been seeing over the last couple of years in the United States and abroad, where these giant companies and multinational conglomerates like Starbucks and Amazon are starting to face like their first true labor test, and we are seeing unions starting to pop up. And I think it is part of a broader conversation in the fabric about where our alliances and allegiances need to be in terms of we have so much more in common with people who are working class. If we are working class, our brothers in the struggle are going to be the other working class folks. And so I think that is an area where we're seeing the kind of blending of interests and from different perspectives as well. We also, I think, labor movements are a particularly interesting example of how a strong democratic country and society can respond, because it's a legally protected right to be able to strike and protest and organize. And those rights are being encroached upon and have been for decades now in the United States. And so, and we are seeing now kind of the one of the end results of that, which is wages have not been rising, and companies have been leaning on gig economy workers and on contractors, and are trying to do as much as they can to limit the benefits and the salaries that they'll pay out. And what we're seeing now is the pendulum swinging the other way, where the workforce is starting to recognize their own ability to push back on that and to organize. So I'm finding that to be a hopeful sign of where growth can come from.
Thank you both. We're starting to get some questions in the chat, so I'm going to ask one more question for the panel discussion, then we'll open it up. And kind of it connects to what both of you were just talking about. And Delma, you talked about this need to connect for the values that are shared and this place of finding commonality, and that brings up the question of so many of the stories you were all telling earlier had underlying places where there is hyperpolarization being pushed. That in many of the places where there is a overt push to dismantle democratic institutions, to advance more autocratic rule, there is not only a use of otherization narrative, but there's a use of really creating a polarization that says there's not opposition, there's not differing ideas, there's enemies that don't have legitimacy. And so I'm curious if all of you on the panel could talk not only about what you're seeing in terms of growing polarization, but are you seeing places and opportunities to counter it? Either what can be done to prevent it from happening where, before it happens, and once you get into that hyperpolarization process, what are some of the things we're seeing that can address it?
Sure, I can start with just sort of analysis of what I'm seeing. I mean, we've always had polarization in this country. We've always had deep political polarization. We can go back to the founding of the Republic, the Civil War, Reconstruction, World War II, when some in this country advocated for America first. I think the problem with hyperpolarization that we're seeing now, and you alluded to this in your opening remarks, is the sort of demonization, literally demonization, that leaves no room for compromise. In the past, there was always some room for compromise, despite the fact that there was polarization. But this mainstreaming of the otherization and the demonization, I think makes it hard to find any room for compromise or negotiation to address our social and political differences. We can see this with the introduction, or the reintroduction, I should say, of blood libel type of language. Ex-party or ex-political leader is a devil worshiper, or the framing of partisans of one political persuasion as on the side of good versus evil, or sort of a insertion of faith religion and theology as part of the political discourse, so that it frames, us partisans are on the side of God or the forces of good, and our opponents are working on behalf of or represent the devil and satanic forces. So that kind of blood libel, religious, theological imagery that we see creeping increasingly into the mainstream, I think is extremely troubling, because it just doesn't leave space for any kind of compromise if that's your political enemy or your political opponent. I'm hoping my colleagues will have something more hopeful to say about a solution.
Me temo que no, Jaime. Creo que tienes razón en el de que la polarización ha estado ahí siempre, ¿no? Y creo que algo que tenemos que destacar como un elemento que exacerba la polarización son las redes sociales, los social network sites en inglés, que están atizando esa pira, esa fogata, y nos está dividiendo en bandos muy específicos, ¿no? Yo no quisiera imaginar que hubiera sido del post 9/11 si hubiera habido tantas redes sociales como ahora, y el mensaje de Bush hubiera sido, el mensaje de Bush, if you're not with us, you're against us, hubiera llegado más lejos, ¿no? Como ahorita está llegando el mensaje de presidentes como Bukele, como Bolsonaro, o como el mismo López Obrador en México, en el que está dividiendo, o somos conservadores o estamos con la cuarta transformación. Creo que hay una discusión ahí porque y regreso al espacio público, o sea, el espacio que está en las redes sociales pareciera una nueva arena, ¿no? Una nueva arena donde se discute, pero pues es una arena que está gestionada por compañías privadas sumamente poderosas, y que pues estamos jugando con sus reglas, ¿no? Entonces, que tenemos que aprender a entrar en esas arenas para potenciar el diálogo, para intentar conectar con los valores de las personas, porque si uno hace, por ejemplo, el ejercicio, se suele decir que no hay que alimentar al troll, no hay que alimentar al troll, a esta figura que ataca en las redes sociales, ¿no? Pero cuando no te encuentras con un troll y intentas dialogar, a mí me ha pasado un poco recientemente con un tema de perros, ¿no? Que intentaban demonizar a los pitbulls como, como los perros más peligrosos del mundo, ¿no? Y entonces uno empieza a platicar, a intentar conectar con los valores de las personas que están discutiendo, y curiosamente esa polarización se va diluyendo, ¿no? Esto en un ejercicio mucho más a nivel macro es más complicado, pero creo que si queremos romper esa hiperpolarización, tenemos que empezar a hacerlo.
Thank you for those great comments. We're getting some questions in the chat, so we're going to move there. I'll throw one thing in about the prevention side on hyperpolarization. There is a lot of research that's been done in looking at how important it is to actually intervene early. That you see over and over again, lots of research in terms of the genocide of Rwanda, that there was actually long warning signs about early places where language started moving more and more towards that dehumanizing language. But it was actually a couple of year buildup of inoculating and getting people to start saying, oh, it's normative that happens, before it started moving to the language that was so extreme of calling for genocide. Similar studies have been done about pre-World War II fascist countries in Europe. So I do think one of the things that goes back to a point Delmo was raising earlier is this struggle is not simply waiting for it to actually hit at the ballot box, or for it to be what people are saying is a part of the main narrative. It's really helping people see their role in interrupting and in questioning those narratives when they're at their beginnings. Dave, I'm seeing a comment with some question marks on it as well from David. David, good to see you're here with us around this idea of imagining a new nation, and you're asking where are the positive pulling us forward, visions, images, and stories being created. What are some of those that can be shared? So I'm going to give the panel a minute to be thinking about that. I'll share one from the U.S. perspective. A book came out last week. Steve Phillips, How We Win the Civil War. So the title's not all that uplifting if you think a war analogy is not, but the book really makes an incredibly powerful point in the second half of the book around all the places where community organizers have been playing the long game and are saying it's not about waiting for election day and just coming to people to get out the vote. It's about actually really engaging people and creating real power building. And in the places that are doing that, Harris County, Texas, what happened electorally in 2020 in Nevada and Arizona and Georgia, those weren't anomalies. Those weren't one-time changes. That was about actually centering and making real investment in power building and saying, let's stop having the money dictated by polling of likely voters. So we are completely centering only the people who voted in 4 of the 5 last elections, and therefore ignoring all the people that were systematically pushed away from participating in those elections and were shut out, but actually really looking at doing the organizing and the engagement and supporting participation and supporting political participation. And that has had incredible results in terms of actual wins. The reason that there was a shift in the Senate was that long work that took place in Georgia. Looking at what's happened electorally in Harris County, Texas, what's happened electorally in the last couple of years in Arizona and Nevada is really a place that I think is about imagining a new nation. It's about imagining a nation that's really centering a multiracial coalition and is centering, going back to one of the comments Delma made earlier, that all of our freedom is bound up in everybody else's freedom. And we've got that shift in systems and focus makes it a big difference. So I'll share that as one, and then hopefully my vamping on my reaction to David's comment has given panelists opportunities to point to other visions, images, stories being created that push for imagining new nations or new structures. So we're not just thinking in one context.
I can jump in for a hot second. I think there's a few touch points that come up for me, and I think some of them are rooted historically, and we see some of that play out. So there's a couple points I'm gonna try to make, and I hope this is both succinct and understandable. I think one of the things I've seen at both a local level here in places like Flint, but even beyond, that give me hope, is I think one of the things that has prevented more people from entering the public square is that so often the people whose voices would add the most value are often the people most resource challenged. And there is a type of privilege that comes from being able to even enter into the public square oftentimes, because your basic needs have to often be met first in order to set aside the time and space to engage. And so one of the things I've seen that gives me hope, and I'm reminded, and I'm sure this isn't the first ever example of it, but I'm reminded of an approach that I know the Black Panther Party was often fond of taking, which is, let me feed you, provide you with medical care, let me make sure you have access to decent clothing and shelter, and then we can talk political philosophy. Then we can talk organizing. Then we can talk about how to change the systems, right? But if your basic needs aren't being met, you may not have the space, the capacity, right? You're in a very trauma-based, survival, fight or flight kind of mode. It's hard to then pivot and engage politically. I'm seeing more and more spaces where people are thinking that through as they're thinking about movement building. Do we have childcare available for folks? Can we feed people when they come out? Can we pay people for their time? Do we have the resources for that, right? Because we understand if you're here with us, that means you're not somewhere else doing something else that might need to be done. And that to me is huge, right? And I think the more we can replicate that sort of approach, so long as we live under a capitalistic system, idealism and capitalism need to find an intersection if we're going to get people to engage. And so that definitely gives me hope. And the last thing I'll say, I don't want to take up too much space, is just to point to things like what I saw with Standing Rock, when I think about what I saw with the George Floyd piece. In both instances, I saw a multinational, multi-ethnic, multicultural type of organizing and engagement, right? And whether we think any one of those things were quote unquote successful, I think is irrelevant. I think what it says to me, at least, is that we are coming to understand that our freedoms are inextricably tied in with one another. And I only see the momentum in that building. And that gives me tremendous hope that we can keep our stories that are unique to us, but learn to blend them into a larger narrative. Because at the end of the day, we outnumber a lot of the very people who want to hoard power. There's more of us than there is of them. And the better we can see it as a us, the more likely I think we are to really see some successes. And I'll pause with that.
Thank you, Dylan. What a fantastic reminder and final message of hope. And and there's a lot, when you say we outnumber, from a standpoint of people who want a multiracial, multi-ethnic, pluralistic society and who want democratic values. We have lots and lots of polling data from many countries that we look at that says that actually more people do want that. Not to underplay the challenges. I know we've got time for maybe one more question. There's a couple questions in the chat that other people have commented on saying, yeah, I'd like to hear that too. So I'm just going to throw out the two questions and say, any panelist that wants to grab one or the other, please do so. There's a question, a comment on, hey, this hyperpolarization is really clicking as being true. Are there examples or what's being done to build that common ground, that center, which Thelma, I think you were just really talking about. And then there's another question, Kyla puts in the chat, are there any examples of democracies that have been founded without oppression of anyone when people, or do those go hand in hand? And I'd probably broaden that question to, are there any large scale governance structures that have that? So are there examples of that? So those are two questions that I'm seeing some energy on in the chat, and invite any panelists to grab one or the other of those.
I can't say that I know of any democracy that were founded without the oppression of any group. I'm not sure if this means that democracy and social inequity go hand in hand so much as I think that globally we are largely capitalist, and I think capitalism and social oppression definitely do go hand in hand. And so I Delma, when you earlier just said that we need to find a way for progress and social justice and rights to exist within a capitalist structure, because this is the world that we live in right now. That's exactly right. We need to find ways to incentivize and to create monetary incentives and also monetary support for social justice movements. And because right now, if you're in the nonprofit sector, it's largely people who can afford to be there. It's people who have, a spouse who is working a much more high-paying job, or someone who's coming from money, or someone who is able to, pursue more of their passion than, making sure that they have food on their table. And so we want to make sure that we are not pricing anyone out of the market of social justice. And I think that that is a really critical point.
Thank you, Erin. Well, a huge thank you to everyone who's joined this conversation and to all of the panelists. Today we heard from a number of different perspectives the critical importance of defining democracy more broadly than elections and really looking at structures that raise up and center the voices of all people and that protect against tyrannies of the majority. We heard a lot about, and we're now hearing music. Hey, Chantel, could we just give us one pause on the music, please? Thank you. So that music interlude was brought to you as a wake up to say we're wrapping up, kind of like when they turn the lights off in a restaurant while you're finishing your dessert. Just saying, we've heard some incredible perspectives today. Lots of discussion around the need to connect to widely shared values and to find places of commonality to counter hyperpolarization. Lots of discussion around the need to actually address fundamental needs, whether that's feeding people before you talk political philosophy, really questioning structures of economics and economic systems in countries that all over the world in terms of, do people have access and ability to participate in the democratic and political process. We've heard a lot around the need to really connect the concept of freedom being linked to everybody else's freedom. We've heard from a bunch of different perspectives how important the public square is and how ensuring that civic space is protected, because it is under threat for a reason, because civic space is a place that creates place for voice. So we've heard a lot about how much narrative matters, how much civic space matters, how much real power building and engagement to increase participation, and not just voice, but voice with actual power and teeth. And we hope the conversation will continue. So as you can see on the screen, there's ways to contact us and keep the conversation going. We appreciate everybody joining us today. And for those of you that are in the US, there's an election around the corner. Please make sure that you vote. Please make sure that you help others vote and participate, even though we've said elections are not the only thing. And please make sure that all of us are lending the power of our voices to a more pluralistic democracy. As Delma said, there's more of us in the world that want a multi-ethnic, multiracial, pluralistic democracy as a form of governance that really provides equitable access and deliberative decision-making that takes the needs of others into account. And if we can harness that power, we can use this moment of tipping point to tip to our direction of justice. With that, thank you all for joining us.